All right, let's dive into one of the most defining conflicts of the entire 20th century, the Cold War. We're going to break down this 45-year global standoff that, honestly, shaped the very world that you and I are living in today. It's a huge question, right? Think about it. The United States and the Soviet Union, they fought side by side to defeat fascism in World War II. So what on earth happened? How did they flip so fast from being allies to becoming these mortal enemies, pushing the entire planet to the edge of nuclear war? You know, the name itself really tells you everything. It was a Cold War precisely because the two main players, the US and the USSR, never actually declared war on each other. Not directly, anyway. Instead, they fought in pretty much every other way you can imagine. It was like this global chess match played with spies, technology, propaganda, and tragically, real wars fought by other countries. At its heart, this was way more than just two countries not liking each other. It was a clash of completely opposite visions for humanity. You had the US and its allies in the Western Bloc, all built around capitalism, democracy, and free markets, forming the NATO alliance. And on the other side, the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, driven by communism, a totally state-planned economy, and they formed their own alliance, the Warsaw Pact. These weren't just different policies, they were two fundamentally different ways of life. Okay, so how did it all get started? Well, for that, we have to go right back to the end of World War II, as this brand new kind of dividing line started to get drawn right across Europe. Winston Churchill, he just nailed it with that phrase, an iron curtain. It perfectly captured what was happening. As the Soviet army occupied Eastern Europe, it installed friendly communist governments, and this massive political and ideological wall just slammed down, splitting east from west. The continent was literally cut in half. Now the West's reaction? It was fast, and it was bold. First, you get the Truman Doctrine, where the US basically said, okay, our new foreign policy is containment. We will stop communism from spreading. And they backed that up with the Marshall Plan, pouring billions of dollars into rebuilding Western Europe. And look, this wasn't just charity. The idea was, if you create stable, prosperous countries, the appeal of communism just fades away. When the Soviets tried to choke off West Berlin with a blockade, the Allies responded with a massive, year-long airlift to keep the city supplied. The last piece of the puzzle was NATO, a military pact that basically said, if you attack one of us, you've attacked all of us. The lines were drawn. So, with both sides having nuclear weapons, a direct war was basically off the table. It would have been suicide. So the conflict went global, but it was fought indirectly, and often with absolutely devastating results. And this is how the Cold War got hot. Instead of fighting each other, the US and the USSR would just pick opposite sides in other countries' civil wars or regional conflicts. They'd flood these places with money, weapons, and military advisors, turning what might have been local disputes into these brutal international battlegrounds. I mean, just look at the examples. In Korea, the US backed the South, while the Soviets and China backed the North. In Vietnam, it was America supporting South Vietnam against the Communist North. Then later, in Afghanistan, the US was arming the Mujahideen rebels to fight the Soviet invasion. Millions and millions of people died in these wars, all while serving as pawns in this bigger superpower game. But the fight wasn't just happening on actual battlefields. It was this relentless, all-out race for dominance. You had the nuclear arms race, where both sides built up these insane arsenals that could destroy the planet many times over. Then there was the space race, kicked off when the Soviets launched Sputnik, which became this huge PR battle to prove which system was technologically superior. And under the surface of it all, you had the Shadow War, with spies from the CIA and the KGB locked in this secret, deadly dance all over the world. 1962, a year when all that tension, all that brinkmanship, almost boiled over into a full-blown nuclear apocalypse. This brings us to what is, without a doubt, the single most dangerous moment of the entire Cold War, the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 days, the world was on a razor's edge. So American spy planes are flying over Cuba, and they discover the Soviets are secretly building nuclear missile sites there. I mean, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. President Kennedy put a naval quarantine, basically a blockade, around Cuba. For days, the world just watched, terrified. After some of the most intense negotiations you can imagine, the Soviets finally agreed to pull the missiles out. In exchange, the US secretly promised to remove its own missiles from Turkey later on. Disaster was avoided, but wow, it was way too close.
That crisis was a huge wake-up call for everyone. It actually led to a period where tensions eased a bit, but it also laid bare the deep, deep problems that would eventually cause the whole Soviet empire to just crumble.
Yes, so in the 1970s, you get this period called détente. Leaders were talking, they were signing treaties to limit nuclear weapons, but here's the crucial thing you have to understand. Beneath the surface, the Soviet system was rotting from the inside out. Decades of spending almost all of its money on the military had just wrecked its economy. It just couldn't compete anymore. So in 1985, this new leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, comes to power, and he knows something has to give. He rolls out two radical new policies. The first was glasnost, which means openness, allowing more free speech and criticism. The second was perestroika, a restructuring of the entire broken economy. His goal was to save the Soviet Union, but what he actually did was accidentally unleash forces that he could no longer put back in the bottle. And as all this pressure was building up from inside the Soviet bloc, it was also coming from the outside. US President Ronald Reagan, standing at the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, gave that famous speech, that famous challenge. It was this incredibly symbolic moment that just captured the growing feeling that this division of Europe just couldn't and shouldn't last any longer. And then the end came so fast. It was stunning. In 1989, you had this wave of revolutions, mostly peaceful, that just toppled the communist governments all across Eastern Europe. And then the big one, the Berlin Wall, the ultimate symbol of the Cold War, was torn down by ordinary people. A year later, Germany was reunited. And by the end of 1991, the Soviet Union itself just ceased to exist. It dissolved, and the Cold War was officially over. The end of the Cold War wasn't just the end of a conflict. It totally redrew the map of global power and left behind a legacy that is, well, it's complicated.
Suddenly, with the USSR gone, the United States was the only superpower left standing. Russia, its old rival, was thrown into a decade of economic collapse. And in places like the former Yugoslavia, the iron grip of the superpowers had kept a lid on old ethnic hatreds. Once that was gone, those tensions exploded into horrible new wars. And that really brings us to the big question for today. The Cold War is over, for sure, but its ghosts are all around us. A lot of the alliances, like NATO, and a lot of the rivalries that were born during that time are still defining global politics. So you have to ask yourself, how is the world we're living in right now still a product of that long 45-year struggle?